Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling something pretty intense. We were doing a deep dive into a document called The Profound Sickness, an anti-abortion apologetic.
Right.
And, that title alone tells you this is going to be different. We're going way beyond the usual legal debates, the medical arguments you hear all the time.
Far beyond. Our mission here really is to conduct a rigorous analysis of what this source is actually claiming. And it's an unusual text, you're right. It doesn't just argue against the practice of abortion.
It's bigger than that.
Much bigger. It frames the acceptance, the normalization of it as a kind of foundational catalyst. It's arguing this is the pivotal moment in a profound societal fall.
A societal fall.
Yeah.
I mean, that framing is exactly why we need to analyze this. We're tasked with really carefully conveying the source's argument structure.
Yeah.
It's this comprehensive web that links this one issue to, a huge range of consequences.
Social, legal, theological.
Exactly. And it gets into some very, very controversial spiritual territory towards the end.
And it's so crucial for us to state this up front, especially with material that's this charged. Our job here is to be guides through the source's internal logic. That's it. Mm-hmm. We're here to convey the arguments made within the material. We're focusing completely on the framework it builds without endorsing or opposing its viewpoints. Our goal is to understand how the author constructs this incredibly detailed case.
Absolutely. Our role is one of critical analysis, not advocacy. So let's get to it. What is the fundamental diagnosis here? What's the core thesis of The Profound Sickness?
Okay, so the core thesis posits that the acceptance of abortion is. It's like the starting gun for widespread insanity acceptance.
Insanity acceptance. That's a strong phrase.
It is. And it's a mechanism, the source claims, that causes this pervasive, cumulative damage to mind soul. It's a wound that hits individuals, but then it doesn't stop there.
It cascades, yeah.
It cascades across generations, and that's what, in their view, accelerates the societal decay.
So the document is basically offering this radical diagnosis of modern society.
A completely radical diagnosis. It's suggesting that our contemporary life is suffering from a fundamental foundational wound. A wound where our capacity for truth, for justice, rational order, moral virtue, all of it is actively diminishing.
And the source is claiming that this wound was opened, or at least, ripped wide open,
right,
by the codification and normalization of this one practice into law and culture.
That's the claim. That's the starting point for everything else that follows.
Okay, let's unpack that. If the source is claiming that this damages the very mind soul, what specific human faculties are we talking about? It's not a vague list, is it?
Not at all. It's a very comprehensive checklist.
Okay.
The argument specifies severe damage to intellect, judgment, clarity, rationality, memory, even prudence and charity.
So it's essentially saying that accepting this one thing acts like a Trojan horse. It gets inside and just corrupts the entire operating system of human thought and behavior.
That is a perfect analogy for it. And what's really fascinating here from an analytical standpoint is that the author doesn't just, invent a new psychological framework out of thin air.
Right. Where does this come from?
They draw very heavily on, and they explicitly try to extend, a very old and respected intellectual tradition. We're talking about the theological framework established by St. Thomas Aquinas concerning the wounds of sin.
Okay, so they're reaching way back. Aquinas. That gives the argument a certain, intellectual heft.
It does. And this is where you can see the structural genius of the apologetic, whether you agree with it or not. It's trying to bridge the spiritual with the modern psychological. It correlates these ancient theological concepts, the wounds inflicted on human nature by the fall, with a very specific, contemporary, and often, empirically documented psychological dysfunctions.
So it's trying to give these old spiritual ideas a kind of modern clinical relevance.
Exactly. It's a powerful rhetorical move.
All right, let's walk through these wounds one by one. Let's start with the first one. Ignorance. Theologically, as I understand it, Aquinas said that sin clouds our ability to see moral truth. It leads to a darkening of the intellect. So how does the source map that onto, the modern psychological landscape?
The source makes a direct link. It connects that theological concept of ignorance to cognitive distortion and a really specific concept called schema entrenchment.
Okay, cognitive distortion, I think most people have heard of. Irrational thought patterns, right?
Right. But schema entrenchment is the key here. So a cognitive schema it's a deeply held, often totally unconscious pattern of thought or a belief system we use to interpret everything in the world.
So we're talking about our fundamental mental rules, the things we believe without even thinking about them.
Exactly, the non-negotiables.
Yep.
And the source argues that when a profound moral falsehood, like the idea that, say, my convenience trumps a nascent human life, when that becomes normalized, it gets entrenched deep within our collective mental schemas.
It becomes an unconscious assumption.
An assumption that then resists all contradictory evidence, whether that's biological evidence, ethical arguments, theological arguments. It doesn't matter. The schema protects itself. And this structural damage, then, it manifests as what the source calls moral blindness.
So the ability to see objective truth is damaged because the very framework you're using to evaluate truth is distorted.
Precisely. And that leads a society to accept what the source considers profound falsehoods as moral realities.
That's a critical piece of their rhetoric. So the impairment isn't just about choosing wrongly, it's about not even being able to recognize what is right in the first place.
The compass is broken.
Okay, so let's move on to the second wound, malice. Theologically, this is the corruption of the will. It weakens our natural desire for good and makes us choose poorly.
Malice, in this framework, is correlated with callous unemotional traits and reactive aggression.
Callous unemotional traits, CU traits. That's language from psychopathology, isn't it?
Yeah. It is. CU traits are central markers associated with psychopathy and antisocial behavior. We're talking about a profound lack of empathy, a lack of guilt, a lack of concern for other people's feelings.
Okay, that makes a kind of grim sense within their logic. If you're willing to accept the termination of the unborn, the source is suggesting that your core emotional and moral machinery is permanently damaged.
The argument is that the corruption of the will, what Aquinas called malice, inherently weakens your ability to choose the true self-sacrificial good. And this then fundamentally distorts the very concept of charity or love.
How so?
It reduces love from a sacrificial, action-oriented virtue to just sentimentality, or even worse, pure self-interest. If your will is compromised by malice, your ability to feel and act with genuine compassion toward the vulnerable gets replaced by emotional coldness and an increased tendency toward aggression when you're challenged on it.
So, the intellect is darkened by ignorance. The desire for good is corrupted by malice. What about the strength to resist future failures? The third wound is weakness.
Yeah.
Traditionally, that means a proneness to future sin, right? An inability to resist temptation.
That's right. And the source maps this concept of weakness onto learned helplessness and what it calls impaired agency.
Learned helplessness. That's the psychological state where you've experienced so many negative things you can't control that you stop trying to escape even when you can.
You become convinced you're powerless. And the source seems to be arguing that the societal acceptance of this foundational sin just destroys the muscle of moral resistance. It makes societal manipulation almost inevitable.
Does the source give a timeline for this? When this helplessness became so widespread?
It's less a timeline and more of a chain reaction.
Yep.
It implies that the systemic embrace of what it sees as a grave moral failure, like abortion, creates this atmosphere where resisting all other insanities just starts to feel futile. It reinforces that feeling of powerlessness.
The logic being, if you can't even protect the most innocent and helpless form of life,
then how can you possibly resist coercion in any other area? This vulnerability to manipulation, to coercion, it means individuals lose that internal moral strength, that moral grit that you need to push back against escalating societal vice.
Okay, finally we have the fourth wound, concupiscence, the theological concept of disordered desire, where your appetites start to rule your reason.
And this one is linked directly to hedonic dysregulation, impulsivity, and addiction.
Hedonic dysregulation. Can you break that down for us?
Sure. It's basically the technical term for the failure of the brain's pleasure and reward systems to maintain a stable, satisfying state. It's what pushes a person toward an obsessive, often destructive pursuit of pleasure.
So in plain English, it's the inability to find true, lasting satisfaction. You're just constantly needing the next hit, the next rush of pleasure, just to feel normal.
Precisely. And the source argues that normalizing vices, starting with this one, habituates individuals to prioritizing immediate, self-centered gratification over any long-term moral, communal, or familial good.
So the constant search for pleasure, or, just as importantly, the avoidance of pain.
Which is dictated by concupiscence, this disordered desire, translates directly into a society that's just riddled with impulsive decision-making and all kinds of addiction.
So let's recap this interlocking system of damage. We have ignorance, which destroys the ability to recognize truth. Malice, which destroys the will to love. weakness, which destroys the power to resist evil, and concupiscence, which destroys rational self-control. What's the end result of all this for society as a whole?
The resulting state, according to this document, is a profound self-accelerating societal dysfunction. The core claim is that the intellects of individuals become so darkened that society systematically starts to rationalize what it calls grave evils as normal.
And that's the definition of insanity acceptance.
That is the definition. And the source is really clear that this damage isn't just contained to one generation. That's a critical part of the argument.
Right, it introduces this concept of generational erosion.
Yes. The argument suggests that children who are raised in this environment, where these moral insanities are the norm and where emotional coercion is common, they actually develop impaired neurocognitive functions. Their moral schemas are built on a faulty foundation from day one.
And the conclusion from that is pretty severe.
It is. The systematic damage, it claims, accelerates a fall into hell, where the societal capacity for virtue just progressively diminishes generation after generation, creating this deepening moral void.
So if these four wounds are, as the source claims, destroying the internal software of the mind, what external real-world proof does it point to? Where's the evidence that society is now universally impaired? This is where the material pivots, right? From theological diagnosis to concrete examples.
It does. It immediately tries to establish a baseline for what it considers a sane society by using a very specific historical anecdote. And it contrasts that powerfully with a modern phenomenon to, in its view, prove the presence of this moral desensitization.
And it's such a powerful piece of rhetoric for the source to go from this abstract theological framework straight into the specific, iconic contrasts of the Kim Feud photograph.
The Napalm Girl photo. The source reminds us of the global reaction to that 1972 photo of the Vietnamese girl burned by napalm. It argues that this single image of a child suffering ignited genuine, widespread global outrage.
And it was a major factor in fueling pressure to end the Vietnam War.
Right. The source holds this up as evidence that society at that time, for all its faults, still possessed a functioning moral core. They still had the capacity to be outraged by that kind of suffering.
And the modern contrast it uses to prove the current sickness. It's deeply disturbing.
It is. It contrasts that 1972 reaction with the modern situation. Specifically, it cites the readily accessible, constant stream of video evidence of mass killings and intense suffering in Gaza over a prolonged period. And it makes the point that much of this is funded or enabled by Western tax dollars.
And what's the perceived reaction to this massive scale of suffering, according to the source?
A screaming silence and little outrage among the masses or the governing powers, especially when you compare it to the reaction in 1972.
The diagnosis for this difference, then, is that it's a chilling indicator of evil blindness and this profound damage to mind-soul.
Exactly. The source basically concludes that a society that has normalized the quiet killing of the innocent in the womb has fundamentally lost the capacity for genuine moral shock. It's lost its ability for righteous outrage when it's confronted with the killing of the innocent on a mass public scale somewhere else.
The desensitization is total, in their view. This diagnosis of moral desensitization then sets the stage for looking at other symptoms of this declining society. Specifically, it moves to the severe erosion of family and fatherhood.
And it points directly to legal mechanisms like no-fault divorce as direct evidence of society prioritizing concupiscence, that disordered desire over structure and stability.
How does it frame no-fault divorce?
It frames it as a system that allows the dissolution of the fundamental family unit, often at the unilateral whim of just one spouse. The argument is that this can happen without sufficient consideration for the consequences to the children or to the other parent who wants to keep the family together.
So in a truly sane, structured society that valued virtue and stability, the source claims that this act unilaterally dismantling a family would be seen as deeply immoral.
And systemically destructive.
Absolutely.
The source suggests that this legal acceptance is a prime example of the system prioritizing individual disordered desire over the critical structural good of the family unit, which it sees as the foundational cell of all society.
And that ties right back to the corruption of the will and the rise of individualism over charity.
It's all connected in this framework.
And this leads to the second related critique about children and the priorities of the courts. The source highlights what it claims is a systemic disregard for the good of the children.
Yes, and it's very specific here. It cites the disproportionate awarding of custody to mothers, often it claims, neglecting strong evidence to the contrary. The source references studies, which it says are systemically ignored, that show children achieve significantly better life outcomes with an involved biological father, and it makes the point whether or not that father lives with the mother.
So the argument here is that the system isn't just dysfunctional, it's actively working against rational, data-supported actions that would benefit the most vulnerable members of society, the next generation.
Yes, in favor of maintaining what it sees as outdated or emotionally driven judicial norms.
That's the essence of the claim, then. The societal priorities have inverted. They favor adult convenience, adult desires, or legal simplicity over the optimal development and welfare of children. And that's another consequence of the darkening of the intellect.
Another piece of evidence for the diagnosis.
Okay, next, the source takes on the legal system more broadly, with legal inconsistencies and moral inversion. It claims the entire legal framework demonstrates profound insanity.
The argument here focuses on a very precise inversion of justice. It contrasts two entities whose legal status of personhood is treated in radically different ways under current law.
On the one hand, you have the denial of personhood rights to the unborn,
Which the source defines, very simply, as a biological human life at its earliest, most vulnerable stages.
and on the other hand,
On the other hand, the law grants extensive, powerful personhood rights to abstract corporate entities
and the source describes these
as legal fictions created solely for economic purposes.
So the conclusion here is blunt. Prioritizing artificial economic constructs, things that exist only on paper over tangible biological human life is, to the source, proof of a deep legal and moral disconnect. It shows the system has lost its grounding in fundamental justice.
It's elevating material concerns above the sanctity of human existence.
Yeah.
The claim is that this legal inversion is a smoking gun for the damage of ignorance. The foundational inability to distinguish what is real human life from what is abstract, corporate fiction, demonstrates that the legal code of the society is pathologically sick.
This whole structure seems to be building up to its most direct confrontation with the modern pro-choice argument, which is the claim of absolute bodily autonomy.
Yes, the source directly challenges the idea that this autonomy can be applied without precondition when you're dealing with a new life that's been generated through a consensual act.
How does it approach that?
It starts by asserting that a woman implicitly accepts the potential for pregnancy by first exercising her autonomy and choosing to initiate sexual relations. The argument is that because a voluntary act carries an inherent risk, the potential to create new life, the person who undertakes that act implicitly accepts the responsibility to see that risk through.
Meaning, carrying the pregnancy to term, as the life generated is seen as separate from her own body.
Correct. And this is where the source introduces a deeply provocative and, frankly, highly aggressive parallel that's intended to force you to confront assumed legal norms.
This is the example of military conscription.
Yes. The analogy is designed to aggressively challenge the assumption of absolute autonomy. The source points out that men are routinely compelled by law to surrender their bodily autonomy, to risk their lives and their limbs for the perceived good of the nation through the draft.
They're forced into actions that could lead to their death or permanent injury.
Right. So the logic then follows. If society can legally and morally impose this profound, life-threatening burden on men, compelling them to sacrifice their body and potentially their life, then society can, logically and morally, require women to carry a pregnancy to term.
Especially one resulting from a consensual act.
Exactly. The source argues that this requirement is a far, far lesser burden than the one frequently imposed on men through conscription.
It's a stark comparison. The argument is that if autonomy is truly absolute, then conscription has to be immoral. But if conscription is morally acceptable for the nation's good, then the claim of absolute bodily autonomy necessarily fails when it's confronted with the obligation to the new life generated by a voluntary act.
And the source concludes by condemning the idea that, and I'm quoting here, sexual gratification is a right for women, and killing the life she may create is acceptable as utterly insane.
So far, the source material we've been looking at really focuses on abortion as the starting point, the catalyst for the sickness.
Yeah.
But the discussion thread that accompanied the text, it introduces a really compelling counter-argument, suggesting the sickness might actually begin earlier.
Yes, and this is a crucial point of contention within the overall apologetic. This counter-argument posits that abortion is actually a symptom of a deeper, earlier problem, the initial degradation of the male and female relationship and marriage itself.
So it's going upstream from the act of abortion to the context in which it becomes thinkable.
Exactly. And this perspective explicitly echoes the theological narrative of the fall of Adam and Eve. It suggests that the moment that holy union is degraded, the moment the natural complementarity and sacrifice that marriage requires starts to fail, then greater sins will inevitably follow.
So what's the source of that degradation according to this view?
It's identified as sexual liberation. Now, the material is very careful to define this. It's not just about simple sexual freedom. It's an ideology that's defined by a radical emphasis on individual freedom, choice, consent, but also on maximizing pleasure, minimizing pain, and prioritizing personal desire above any and all structural obligation.
And this ideology is what they argue enables all the subsequent sins.
That's the argument. Sexual liberation is the upstream sin that weakens the marriage and the family, which then makes the eventual acceptance of abortion what they see as the ultimate act of convenience and pain avoidance. Not just possible, but logical.
Okay, so can you trace the dominoes for us? How does this degradation of marriage lead to these specific consequences?
The source links it to a few key things. First, the loss of marital priority, which leads directly to the ease of divorce, contrary to the concept of becoming one flesh. Second, the loss of what it calls the mysterion, which is the sacral, holy quality of the marital bond. It becomes a contract, not a covenant.
And it also mentions contraception here.
Right.
The misuse of birth control and contraception is listed as a key factor in weakening the familial bond because it systematically separates the procreative aspect from the sexual act itself.
Yeah.
And all of these actions together, they argue, create a proliferation of what they call sexual sins: fornication, adultery, lust.
So the structural argument is that the confusion about life's sanctity is just a downstream consequence of this much larger disordered state that's rooted in the destruction of the marital and family structure.
And this naturally leads to one of the most provocative and, frankly, disturbing claims in the entire source material.
Okay.
The explicit comparison of this ideology of sexual liberation to an idol.
And not just any idol. They compare it to the ancient Canaanite deity, Molech.
And this connection is meant to be taken absolutely literally. Molech is known in ancient religious texts as an idol that was associated with child sacrifice. The source argues that sexual liberation has become a modern Molech and that our society is sacrificing children to it for the sake of adult desire and convenience. What are the modern forms of sacrifice that it cites? I assume abortion is number one.
Abortion is the primary sacrifice, yes. But it also includes transgenderism, and it frames gender-affirming care as sexual mutilations and the destruction of a child's true self. And it also lists gay adoption, claiming that the deliberate denial of a child's right to both a mother and a father is another form of sacrifice for the sake of adult fulfillment.
This framing asserts that the consequences of this idolatry aren't just moral, they're demographic, they're geopolitical.
Exactly. The result, according to the source, is a massive decline in married couples, plummeting birth rates, and ultimately a dying culture that's morally bankrupt and unable to sustain or defend itself. And this vacuum, they claim, then invites a flood of foreigners with witchcraft, false prophecy, more idols,
Resulting in what they call a new Sodom and Gomorrah.
where the original moral failure perpetuates foreign replacement and even deeper corruption. It connects the degradation of personal morality directly to massive geopolitical change.
So beyond the sexual and familial breakdown, the source offers this comprehensive list of other societal ills, right? The broader societal manifestations of sickness, which it sees as more evidence of this escalating decay.
Yes, and we see the decline manifesting heavily in the area of economic and political decline. The source cites the public's acceptance of protracted, non-beneficial wars where the average citizen gains nothing but debt and casualties, and the systematic impoverishment of citizens through unchecked policies.
And crucially, they highlight the loss of political speech and agency.
Due to the systematic transfer of power and wealth to what the source specifically calls corporate demonic forms, this transfer of power away from the people and to these non-human abstract entities is viewed as another way the populace is crippled, and it demonstrates a society that's lost its rational self-interest.
The second area of evidence is even more focused. It's on sexual disorders, which are presented as the late-stage symptoms of that initial wound of sexual liberation.
Right. The source lists the normalization of sex as a choice, completely outside of any traditional moral frameworks, which it argues enables the pursuit of increasingly bizarre or harmful sexual expressions.
And the most extreme examples cited here are highly specific and controversial.
Very. It points to what it calls sexual mutilations of psychologically damaged people, which is a direct reference to gender-affirming surgeries, and what it calls the widespread sexual grooming of young children in public schools.
These acts are presented as the most extreme and irreversible manifestations of this disordered sexuality, this deepening moral depravity.
And they're seen as direct attacks on the most vulnerable, demonstrating a complete breakdown of protective structures, parental, educational, everything.
And finally, the source presents what it sees as the ultimate symptom of the devaluation of life: the acceptance of euthanasia.
The logic is that, having normalized the destruction of life at its beginning with abortion, the next logical step is to normalize the destruction of life in the face of suffering, or even just fleeting mental states. The source views the acceptance of euthanasia for things like depression or similar whims as the final profound step in the culture of death.
It demonstrates a society that now embraces death as an ultimate solution, rather than struggling towards virtue in life.
That's the argument. It's the full circle of devaluing human life.
Okay, so we've talked about the symptoms, the social decay, the whole psychological framework of decline. Now we have to turn to the source's explicit fundamental diagnosis for why. Why is this pervasive insanity not only happening, but accelerating? And it's a spiritual diagnosis. The source posits this isn't just accidental human failure.
Not at all. It is explicitly attributed to the deliberate action of a demonic director or a satanic war. And this hypothesis, it fundamentally shifts the entire problem from the realm of, political or moral debate into one of orchestrated malice that's driven by supernatural forces.
And the source assigns a very specific historical marker to this spiritual shift in governance, a date that it sees as the inflection point for the entire nation.
It does. The legalization of abortion in 1973 is framed in this material not just as a legal decision. It's framed as a public announcement that Satan rules the federal government.
Wow.
That date is claimed to signify a profound, explicit moral and governmental inversion, orchestrated by malevolent spiritual forces. It validates, in their view, the spiritual control of the nation's political institutions.
And this is where the argument introduces the global power structure that it claims is behind this spiritual war, the synagogue of Satan.
This is identified as a clandestine, global, hidden power structure that's operating across the world. And it exercises control through what the source identifies as its minions.
And the source is explicit in naming these groups.
Very explicit. It lists Zionists, modernists, Freemasons, Illuminati, and Satanists. The core claim is that these groups have systematically infiltrated and corrupted all the major institutions, from government to banking, education, the media, to execute this satanic agenda.
And the goal of this structure, according to the source, is equally specific and highly charged.
The material claims the overarching goal is the systematic destruction of traditional moral values. Specifically, it's targeting the structures that are associated with white Christian men and fatherhood, which this worldview sees as the last bastions of moral resistance.
So these forces are seen as actively promoting female evil and man-hating to dismantle the established moral and societal order.
An order built on the traditional family unit, yes.
And this brings us to a highly controversial and inflammatory claim about gender roles and their alleged function within this spiritual war. The source claims that women have become a primary tool, maybe an unwitting one, of this synagogue of Satan.
This is one of the most specific and frankly bizarre and structurally significant claims in the entire source. The material asserts that women have become, and this is a direct quote, the synagogue of Satan minions, fifth column, destructive, mind-crippled, programmed golem army that's found in all families and throughout all significant institutions.
Okay, we need to unpack that golem analogy. That's a very specific reference.
It is. In Jewish folklore, a golem is a creature that's animated by mystical means. It acts without true free will or moral agency. It just carries out the will of its creator. So by labeling women as this mind-crippled, programmed golem army, the source is arguing that they're no longer acting on true moral agency or divine inspiration,
but rather as manipulated, damaged agents.
Exactly. Whose actions, which are driven by those four wounds of sin we talked about, especially concupiscence and weakness, are actually executing the societal destruction planned by the demonic director. They're framed as the frontline destructive force inside our homes and our institutions.
This narrative suggests the corruption is so pervasive that it even extends into the last place you would think to seek moral guidance, religious authority, which leads to the claim of religious corruption.
The framework claims that the Synagogue of Satan successfully infiltrated the office of the Pope and the Vatican in 1958. This specific date and event are cited as resulting directly in the modernist false Catholic Church and the heresy-filled Vatican II, which happened shortly after.
Why is that specific date, 1958, so crucial to their narrative of decline?
Because if the highest moral and spiritual authority on earth, as they see it, the Catholic Church, was compromised in 1958, then every subsequent action, every doctrine, every teaching from that institution is viewed as corrupted.
So it serves to eliminate the possibility of any organized spiritual guidance or resistance coming from established religious institutions.
It leaves the individual completely isolated against these demonic forces and this structural corruption. It reinforces the idea that the sickness is total and structural, not just an individual problem.
So the source completes its cycle here. It's arguing that the intellectual damage, ignorance, is now codified in our laws. The moral damage, malice, is enforced through our media. And the spiritual guideposts, the church, have been corrupted from the very top down.
If we synthesize this entire extensive narrative, what the source presents is a complete closed-loop argument. You have a foundational sin, take your pick, abortion or sexual liberation, that inflicts the 4 traditional wounds on the human soul. It destroys the ability to know truth, desire good, resist temptation, and control desire.
Right, the internal damage.
And that internal damage then manifests externally as measurable, widespread societal decline. That encompasses family erosion, economic injustice, moral inversion, everything we've talked about. And finally, this whole destructive process isn't a human accident. It's driven and directed by explicit, powerful spiritual forces that are operating through these hidden structures.
It's a profound and incredibly comprehensive worldview, and it's all built on a single, pivotal moral point. The future painted by this narrative is, well, it's overwhelmingly bleak. It suggests imminent collapse. But the discussion thread offers a fascinating conclusion that argues for a required societal suffering before any change can even happen.
Yes. One commenter makes the argument that true moral restoration can't happen while people still enjoy the comforts that distract them from the consequences of their moral failures. They believe people must, and this is their phrase, experience hell.
Meaning endure some catastrophic societal hardship.
And be forced to become cornered animals in order to finally give up their present destructive comforts and vices. The idea is that only extreme adversity can shock a society out of its entrenched state of insanity acceptance.
But the source material itself, it also offers a subtle counter-observation, right? It suggests a kind of natural or organic restoration process might already be underway, independent of any systemic collapse.
That counter-observation notes that there may already be a revival of religiosity among the younger generations. But crucially, this revival is claimed to be concentrated primarily among those who are identified as genetically healthy people who reproduce and adhere to traditional moral structures.
So the implication there is a kind of quiet, almost demographic revival.
That seems to be the suggestion, that those who are carrying the corruption and the 4 wounds of sin will simply fail to perpetuate themselves, while those who adhere to moral clarity and who are reproducing successfully will naturally propagate a restored moral order without needing some catastrophic external event.
It's a provocative conclusion. It posits that redemption might arrive either through forced, catastrophic suffering or through a quiet, internal demographic revival driven by those who reject the fundamental sickness.
Indeed. The source, at every turn, forces us to consider the absolute foundational relationship between moral clarity and the stability of societal structure.
So we'll leave you with this challenging question that's derived from our deep dive today. If the fundamental moral clarity that's described by the source, whether you define that as a return to traditional virtue or the expulsion of this spiritual corruption, if that were suddenly achieved, which of the myriad social ailments described in this deep dive, the economic decline, the legal inversions, the family dissolution, the desensitization to suffering, which of those do you think would be the first to truly disappear?
Thank you for joining us on the Deep Dive.